Good afternoon, subscribers. So here we are once again on the GCSE stimulus material, and today I want to talk to you about this, which is figure 7, I believe, with regard to global poverty and development. So as you'll be aware, of course, what does this chart show us? It shows us a range of different countries, and it's the percentage of people living in absolute poverty in different regions of the world. Now, don't be surprised if you're asked some fairly straightforward questions with regard to this. So you might be asked to compare data. That would be a fairly standard thing to be asked to do in a question such as this. But I think the most intriguing and some of the most interesting points on this are as follows. Number one, we can see here with regard to, this is East Asia and Pacific, the decline in the number of people and the proportions of population living in absolute poverty, very significant decline, coming down from almost 60% to about 5%, maybe even slightly less in that instance. And then to compare and contrast that with Sub-Saharan Africa, which starts here at around 55, eventually settling after a period of up and down to around about the 40-42% mark. Now, I think something which you may be asked about might be to consider the reasons why Sub-Saharan Africa has found it so difficult to bring down the levels of absolute poverty. And so what I'd like to do is to just share with you some articles which I think are really useful in this regard, with regard to helping us to understand and analyse this data. So I'm just going to flick into a few links here, web links, and I'll put the links obviously below so that you can use those and have a look at them yourselves. So, number one, ladies and gents, just a map really of Sub-Saharan Africa, and just to show you the area that we're talking about here. And of course you'll be familiar, I'm sure, with many of these countries, and indeed some of the pre-release material in the past produced by OCR has focused on countries such as Uganda, for example, such as Zambia, which was the focus of a pre-release case study on copper not so long ago. So this is the area in which we're thinking, and these are the countries that we're talking about. I think it always helps just to know exactly where we are talking about globally and to get a feel for the countries involved. Secondly, what are we talking about in terms of population size? Well, we're talking about just over 1 billion people. So we're talking about, again, about a very significant, very substantial population, similar to China and India in that respect, the same sort of size that we're talking about. And then, ladies and gentlemen, let us have a consideration as to why Africa, Sub-Saharan Africa, has found it so difficult to reduce these poverty levels. So this is a great article, ladies and gents, which addresses that very key question. Why is the number of poor people in Africa increasing, even in spite of the fact that its economies are growing, just like most global economies are? So this article sets out 5 reasons, and I'll very quickly just run through those 5 reasons for you. You, of course, can look at them in more detail in your leisure time. So, number 1. The first reason is the region's rapid population growth. So this all goes on to explain that GDP is rising, but of course, as you know, GDP per capita is calculated by GDP divided by the population. Well, if GDP rises by 10% but population is growing by 20%, then clearly the welfare and the wealth of the citizens of that country will be on the decline because the GDP per capita will be falling. So that's reason number 1, rapid population growth. Number 2, the depth of poverty. Now, what does that mean in this context? Well, you know that if you're in a country in absolute poverty, you're living on less than $1.90 a day. Now, this article goes on to explain that other developing nations who have grown and come out of absolute poverty, their base starting point has been around the 98 cents mark. So in order to bring them up to absolute poverty levels, they have been, been required to grow by, per person and per capita, 92 cents per person. However, in Sub-Saharan Africa, the level of poverty is much deeper. And the starting point there is not 98 cents, but it's actually 74 cents. And so as a consequence of that, to bring them in Sub-Saharan Africa up to the level of absolute poverty at $1.90, they're actually having to grow by $1.16 compared to 92 cents. So that's point number 2. The base starting point is much lower. Point number 3. Inequality is already at unusually high levels. So what does that mean in this context? What it means is that the factors of production, which will obviously yield an income for people, they're already owned by people and a small number of people, and everybody else has nothing. And so as the economy starts to grow, that is to the benefit of the few and not to the many. And so as a consequence of that, the trickle-down effect, I suppose, is taking so much longer because the wealth is concentrated very much in the hands of the few. Now, I went on to explain a little bit to my students about the Gini coefficient and the Lorenz curve, which I'm sure any GCSE examiner would love to see in a GCSE paper, but strictly speaking, that's really, we're talking sort of year 12 economics there. But that's something to also maybe consider, Gini and Lorenz. Point number 4, the degree of mismatch between where the growth is arising and where the poor actually are. So if we go back here to our map, if the growth is actually arising, say, here, here, and here, but the levels of poverty and deprivation are concentrated in the central Sub-Saharan Africa, then obviously that it's not necessarily going to feed into and feed up and feed around. So the wealth isn't spread out in that respect. And then finally, point number 5 simply refers to the quality of the data. We're a developed nation, so we could probably fairly easily measure standards of living and improvements or deteriorations in. However, in the Sub-Saharan African continent, that is much more difficult simply because it's a poor country anyway, and so their methods of collecting data and analysing data are not up to maybe the standards that we would anticipate and expect. Okay, so that's the 5 factors linked below. And then finally, ladies and gentlemen, this is a tremendous article from the Financial Times, quite a recent one, I believe. I remember tweeting this one out not that long ago. What date was it? 7th of Feb 2018. So it's nice and up to date. And again, we've got some stuff here, particularly with regard to China and Sub-Saharan Africa. It gets mentioned the whole way down, really. I'll let you have a read through this yourselves, but the whole gist of this is it talks about discoveries of mineral resources leading to substantial growth in the Middle East. And obviously the Middle East is one of the lines on your data set that you're presented with. Talks about Sub-Saharan Africa, substantial growth in wealth, but again this whole notion of population growth outstripping the growth in wealth. And that's really something which is repeated as you move down here constantly. So the UAE, United Arab Emirates, again Middle East, we're talking about oil and so on. And again we can relate that back to our figure 7. Just trying to have a look again for Sub-Saharan Africa. If we can find it somewhere. You will find it, I'm sure. Some nice data here with regard to China. Talking about the increases in education, employment of its growing population, and as a consequence, obviously, educated workforce in employment coming out of absolute poverty helps to explain that very dramatic decline. So, 1, 2, 3, 4 great links there, ladies and gentlemen. I'll put the links below, check those out, and hopefully you'll be able to apply that to figure 7.